A very good morning, my dear students. Yesterday we had studied indifference curve, and today we are going to study the properties of indifference curve. The first property of indifference curve is IC slopes downward. What is IC? IC is indifference curve. IC slopes downward from left to right. It means that IC has a negative slope. Why does IC curve move from left to right? Because it has a negative slope. It implies that if a customer decides to have more of one good, he must have less of the other. It means that if we are consuming two goods and we want to have more of one good, then in that case we have to consume less of the other good. It is only then that the satisfaction level would remain constant at different levels of the IC. Let us refer to the figure 2. At point A on the IC, the consumer has 5 oranges and 2 apples. Moving from A to B, he has 3 apples, that is 1 more than before, and 3 oranges, 2 less than before. When the consumer moves from point A to B and he has 3 apples instead of 2, his satisfaction level from apples must rise. Since A is equals to B in terms of satisfaction level, he must consume less of oranges so that the rise in the satisfaction level due to higher consumption of apples is counterbalanced by the fall in the satisfaction level due to the lower consumption of oranges. That means if we are consuming two commodities, say apple and oranges, if we are increasing the consumption of apples, we'll have to reduce the consumption of orange. Then only the satisfaction level can be maintained. Now we can see in this figure, that is the IC curve slopes downward. Since consumption of two good is inversely related, IC must have negative slope. So I hope you have understood why it has a negative slope. It has a negative slope because the two commodities which the consumer is consuming, there is inverse relation between them. If we are consuming more of apples, as you can see from the graph, apples we have consumed from 2 to 3, the consumption of oranges will decrease from 5 to 3. Is it clear? So satisfaction level at A is equals to satisfaction level at B because A and B are on the same IC. Moving from A to B, when the consumption of apple increases, consumption of orange must decrease. You have to remember this, that if the consumption of apples is increasing, the consumption of orange has to decrease. Only then the satisfaction level can remain constant between A and B. Since consumption of two goods on the IC is negatively related, IC must slope downward. This also you have to remember, because the consumption of two goods on the IC is negatively related, IC must slope downward. Okay, so is it clear? This is the slope, it is going downwards. Okay, now the second feature or the second characteristics of IC curve. The second feature is IC is convex to the origin. What does it mean when we say that IC is convex to the origin? It means that the slope of IC tends to decline as we move along the IC from left to right. It means that the slope of IC tends to decline as we move from left to right. The slope of IC is called marginal rate of substitution. It indicates the rate at which the consumer is willing to substitute one good for the other. Okay, so the slope is declining. Why? Because we are substituting one good for the other. MRS refers to the rate at which the consumer is willing to substitute one good for the other. MRS refers to the rate at which the consumer is willing to sacrifice good Y for good X. Now the question arises, why should MRS decline, that is marginal rate of substitution? As more and more units of good X are consumed by the consumer, his intensity of desire for good X tends to decline, implying that marginal utility of good X tends to fall. On the other hand, as more and more units of good Y are given up, his intensity of desire for good Y tends to rise, implying that marginal utility of good Y tends to rise with every additional unit of it being sacrificed. It is because of this, for every successive unit of good X, the consumer is willing to give up less and less amount of good Y. Accordingly, change upon Y upon change upon X, sacrificing Y per unit of additional X, tends to fall as we move down the IC. Thus, IC is convex to the origin. Now, you have to understand this thing that we were consuming two commodities, apples and oranges. As we consume more apples, we have to consume less of oranges. Then only we can consume the more apples and maintain the satisfaction level. But as we are consuming more apples and reducing the consumption of oranges, what is happening? Our intensity or desire for oranges is increasing, because as we had discussed earlier, if we have less of something, we want it more. And because of this, every time when he's consuming more apples, the sacrificing which he is making for oranges, that sacrifice is decreasing. Earlier he was ready to sacrifice more, but now as he consuming more apples, he is reducing the sacrifice. And this is because, as the law applies here, that if we have more of something, we want it, the intensity is less, and if we have less of something, the intensity to have it is more. So that is why MRS tends to decline. Between points A and B, the consumer is willing to give up 1.5 units of good Y for one more unit of good X. So MRS is equals to change in Y upon change in X. But as we move down the curve, we find that between points B and C, the consumer is willing to give up 1.5 units of good Y only when he gets 2 units of good X in return. It is because of diminishing MRS that IC is convex to the origin. You can see here in the slope, in this graph, that is figure 4, that IC is convex to the origin, implying diminishing MRS. There are various points A, B, C, D. You can see here that in A, X was 2 and Y was 6. That is, MRS is change Y upon change X. Then when he consumed 3 apples or 3x, then Y was 4.5, that is 1.5 minus 1.5 will get. Then it is 5 here and 3y, then we get minus 0.75, then 7x and 25y, then we get minus 0.25. So MRS is change in Y upon change in X. These are the values, which means it is diminishing. Minus 1.5, minus 0.75, minus 0.25. Okay. Now, the next property comes, higher IC shows higher level of satisfaction. In the curve, you can see that they have made various IC curves, IC1, IC2, IC3, IC4. Now the curve which is in the higher side, that is IC4, give us the maximum satisfaction, and the satisfaction goes on decreasing. That is, IC3 will have less satisfaction, IC2 will have less, and IC1 will have the minimum. So higher IC implies higher level of satisfaction. Now as you can see, IC need not be parallel to each other. When you are making these curves, they need not be parallel to each other, and they never touch or intersect each other. They are also not touching or intersecting each other. With reference to the following observation need to be carefully noted. Higher IC indicates higher level of satisfaction. IC4 indicates higher level of satisfaction than IC3. IC3 indicates higher level of satisfaction than IC2, and IC2 indicates higher level of satisfaction than IC1. Each IC in the indifference map corresponds to the different level of consumer's income. Higher IC corresponds to the higher level of income. Now we'll discuss the next property. IC do not cross or intersect each other. What does it mean? It means that consider points A and B. These are on the IC1. Therefore, these are equal in terms of the level of satisfaction. A is equals to B. Likewise, A is equals to C, as these are on the IC2. So, They never cross or intersect each other. Since A is equals to B and A is equals to C, we can conclude that B is equals to C. But this is not logical because at both B and C the consumption of good Y is the same, but at C the consumption of good X is greater than B, implying that C must be offering higher level of satisfaction. Now the next point, IC does not touch x-axis or y-axis. This is because IC considers the consumption of two goods simultaneously. If IC touches y-axis, it would mean that consumption of good X is 0. Likewise, if IC touches X, it would mean that the consumption of good Y is 0. So it would never touch x-axis or y-axis. Okay, I hope you have understood. Thank you, class.